Okay, you all saw the title of the video. Today we are covering could an orc invasion force from the Second War for Armageddon conquer modern day Earth. This video shall be split into 4 parts, those being orc and Gretchen troop numbers, orc equipment, orc tactics and leadership, and finally after we discuss all that, then we shall get to what would realistically happen. With that said, let's start off the scenario, but just before we do, more than 86% of you who watch my videos aren't subscribed, so if you enjoyed this one, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Okay, enough shilling, let's just get into it. First, let's talk about the scale and troop numbers of the orc invasion force. It's stated that millions of orcs partook in the Second War for Armageddon, but as is usually the case for the 40K, direct numbers aren't stated. So we are just left to try our best to guess them from little lore excerpts that we do possess. We know that the majority of the orc invasion force partook in the attack across the Paladin Mountains, which would imply that the 3 columns that penetrated the mountains were at least 50% of the overall force. We know that once Traitor von Straub ordered Titans, Skitaris and PDF elements to stop 2 of those columns that were heading towards Hades Hive, that the battle that then ensued involved over 6 million orc infantrymen and several Gargans. Now, it's not really clear in the lore if they had 6 million orcs or if the figure also included Gretchens and human collaborators. I'll be counting it like they are all orcs and will be adding Gretchens to the figures later on in the video, but just know that because we are still talking about GW here, the latter scenario where these figures include all the unit types is probably more likely. So that would mean that each orc column consisted of minimum 3 million orcs. Now multiplying 3 million orcs per column by 3 columns, we get a total of 9 million orcs, which would mean that 9 million orcs would be 50% of the overall force, meaning that the full force would number somewhere in the ballpark of 18 million orcs. Let's round that up to 20 million for the sake of pretty round numbers. Now let's talk about Gretchens. If you watched my video about the realistic Imperial Guard numbers, you would know that for each fighting soldier you need at least 5 to 15 Logi personnel, of course depending on the theater and geography of the conflict zone. So using the middle end of estimates that there are, let's say, 10 Gretchens for each orc, we get that there would be roughly 200 million Gretchens overall. So my best estimates for the orc numbers of the Second Armageddon War are 20 million orcs and 200 million Gretchens. Okay, now let's get to part 2 of the video, that being the orc equipment. Let's start off with the orc vehicles, which can be placed in either one of 3 categories. Those categories being light vehicles, medium vehicles and walkers. In light category you can find bikes and troop transports, which are essentially just trucks with guns. These light vehicles are by far the most numerous in any orc army, possibly even being 60 to 70% of the overall force. That being said, they are complete and utter rubbish, and not just in a metaphorical sense. They are built from rusted sheet metal plates glued together via bubblegum and hopes and dreams of their crews. They are also very prone to spontaneously blowing up or malfunctioning. When it comes to numbers, there should be roughly 10 to 15 million of these war bikes and trucks. Then we come to the medium class, which has a lot of different vehicle variants, which include but are not limited to Grot Tank, Bren Crusher, Gob Smasher, Battle Wagon and many other appropriately orky vehicle types. But most of these boil down to one of 2 categories, APC or tank. APCs are just transports that have lots of sheet metal bolted onto them. They are known for having such shitty manufacturing standards that their armor often falls off mid-battle. Fuel is placed all over the place, which can turn the truck into an oven if hit, and potentially even without being hit. Steering wheel sometimes gains a mind of its own and detaches itself from the truck, allowing Gork and Mork to take control and deliver them to their destination. Troop transports also don't have any shock absorbers, making the whole ride a very bumpy one, and giving the orc shooting from the top hatch even more debuffs towards accuracy. And there are also numerous other issues that I don't have the time to go over. And it goes without saying, but next to no orc vehicles possess thermals, night vision, rangefinders, blowout panels, accurate fire control systems, and the radios are so rare that they might as well not exist. Then we get to the orc tanks. Imagine, if you will, taking a Bob sample, enlarging it, putting more sheet metal onto it, and giving it a 120mm cannon, alongside 15 different machine guns, of which half don't even work. Yeah, that's what orc tanks essentially are. They are cramped machine machines in which ammunition and fuel canisters lie everywhere, making them prone to spontaneous combustion. Just like the APCs, they possess no modern sensors, making them very inaccurate and highly unlikely to hit anything beyond 600 to 700 meter range. Overall, these vehicles would make up 10 to 30% of the overall armored force. Okay, now let's get to the orc super heavies, the walkers. I'll skip the killer cans since they are quite easy to take down. Just go watch my video on the sentinels if you want to know why. So let's just skip to the big boys, the orc stompas and gargans. The basic stompa is just a pile of trash that moves using teeny tiny legs. They are equipped with a mountain of guns and usually just one power shield. Orc power shields are similar to Imperial void shields, just more shitty. They can't be brought back up once down, they sometimes flicker and allow projectiles to pass through, they can't protect you from slow moving projectiles and so on. Also, the armor is astonishingly crap, since it mostly just consists of bolted plates of sheet metal that are not especially hard to break through. I believe that it's stated somewhere in the lore that even las rifles and las cannons can pen it, which would be equivalent to our own 50 BMG and 30mm rounds. Also, again, no sensors, except maybe now you do have a couple wire radios for like internal communication, but that's it. Stompas are also relatively tiny, coming in at just 10 to 15 meters, which would be roughly 1/10 of the size of the New York woman. Then we have orc gargans, which are just larger stompas with more guns and a couple more power shields. Yeah, there is not much more to say about them, that's it. Okay, now let's cover the orc small arms, the shutas. Orc shutas are inaccurate, unreliable and crudely constructed pieces of equipment. No joke, the accuracy of the orc shuta is probably comparable to the Civil War era musket, if not worse. If you are standing 200 to 300 meters away from the orc, you are highly unlikely to get hit. Look, what I'm trying to say is that if an Imperial bolt gun is a Colt 1911, then an orc shuta would be a SIG. Okay, now onto the orc body armor. Most orcs use little to no body armor, but that does not mean that they are easy to kill. It's stated that orc skin can tank fully charged las bolts that can even crack concrete. And listen, there is a lot to unpack in that statement. Cracking concrete ain't anything special. Depending on the concrete thickness, even 45 could probably do it. So you would assume that GW was referring to 40K's version of concrete, those being rockcrete and ferrocrete. But it can't be ferrocrete since it was shown on wracks that even las cannons were struggling hard against ferrocrete bunkers. And it can't be rockcrete since rockcrete has no universal formula, so saying that it can be broken is a meaningless statement since its strength would vary by the resource availability of the planet. Regardless, from my readings of the lore, I would say that an unarmored orc git would require either 2 BMG hits, 20 to 30 5.56 hits, or 10 to 15 303s to take out. Of course, with variations to different body parts, one hit to the orc eye with a 50 cal is putting the orc down for good, whilst even 10 to 20 hits to the legs won't do much more other than just slow the orc down. As for the Gretchens, you can probably kill them with even 22 long rifle. Now let's cover the orc tactics and leadership. As you can guess, they are quite simple. Step 1. Get a big group of boys together. Step 2. Put them all on some sort of truck or motorized vehicle. Step 3. Break the thin enemy front line and then advance towards enemy cities or residential areas from which you can acquire a lot of loot to build better and stronger vehicles. And also acquire involuntary servants for all the squig farms and iron mines. Step 4. Re-equip and repeat. And yes, some orcs can be smarter than this and plan traps and ambushes, but those orcs are exceptionally rare. And even they aren't totally immune from sometimes going full Leroy Jenkins towards the enemy gun lines. Okay, with that said, how would the orcs fare against real world militaries? Let's say that an orc invasion force exits somewhere near Mars and starts booking it towards Earth. What would happen next? Well, just like in my Blood Pact scenario, Earth could simply establish radio wave communications with the orcs to see what they are all about. Once the orcs start talking about crumping and smashing gits in butcherized Latin, Earth would quickly come to the realization that they are hostile. And from then on out, you could simply modify the ICBMs to travel to the orc fleet and with the power of portable suns blow it up. This also becomes way easier once you realize that a lot of orc ships don't have multiple shields, but just one that can be easily taken down. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, nukes in space also cause giant EMPs and spew massive amounts of radiation, so the orcs are dying either way. If you don't believe me that a nuke can do this, you can either go read about Starfish Prime, or if you find reading boring, then you can watch KURG's video on what if we nuke the moon, link in the description. Also, if the orc ships were moving at 11,000 kilometers per hour, they would only reach Earth in 2.5 years. And to be clear, I made up the 11,000 figure. Orc ships would be moving much slower than that. Okay, but nuking the orcs before they can even reach Earth is kinda boring, so let's let the orcs hit the Earth and start the ground invasion. So the first thing you have to know is that the orc ships don't have steering systems. Once they enter the atmosphere, they just hope for the best. Considering that would make them crash all over the Earth's surface, and that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, yeah, about 70% of the orc ships are going straight to the bottom of the sea, where they're gonna experience the water pressure treatment and drown. So let's disregard that bit of 40k lore and say that every orc ship has a steering wheel. So where would they land? Well, north and south poles are out of the question, since they are too barren to support the orc population, are too cold for orc comfort, or they have some uneven terrain which would limit the effectiveness of the orcish mechanized forces. Northern America would give a lot of loot, but it also has lots of rivers, rocky mountains and forests, which again would impair the mobility of the orcs. Australia is great because it's flat and has a lot of loot in the cities, but it's also an island, and orcs aren't proficient naval builders. They can do it for sure, but their navies just suck. South America is forested as fuck, so it's a no-go zone. Asia is also quite a bit forested and has lots of mountains, so it's not bad, but it's also not great. Which ultimately leaves 3 places for the invasion, those being Central Asia, Northern Africa or Southern Africa. For this scenario, I'll go with the Southern Africa since it's mostly flat, but also has food reserves in the Congo and the middle portions of the continent. It would also allow the orcs to invade Europe and Asia without having a particularly large navy, by simply going through Egypt, then Turkey or Caucasus. So on the first day of the invasion, orcs would hit Southern Africa and start rampaging through cities, stealing food and vehicles, and going north towards Congo and the Middle Africa. So could the Southern African nations stop them? Well, South Africa has 150,000 soldiers, Congo has 200,000, Angola has 100,000, Zimbabwe has 50, and other nations have, let's say, another 50. That would be 550,000 active duty troops versus 20 million orcs and 200 million Gretchens. Realistically speaking, they would not be having a good time. That being said, they would still be able to put some hurt on the orcs. They could lay ambushes on orc columns with RPGs, cornets, large caliber machine guns, IEDs, mines, and so on. For example, you can hit an orc column with a cornet missile, destroying one truck and making the other orcs chase you. Then you can lead them into a minefield and watch them lose another 10 to 20 vehicles trying to pursue you. This works because of the orc mentality of, yeah, that guy died to mines, but it won't happen to me since I'm just built different. Also, Air Force would be super effective against the orcs, since they don't possess any radar guided missiles, relying on World War II era optical flak platforms for air defense. Also, Orc Air Force is a joke. They fly World War II era propeller or simple jet aircraft, relying on guns instead of missiles to shoot down enemy planes or strafe ground targets. These orc planes would be easy targets for both modern or even Cold War era aircraft and air defense. Due to orcish planes' boxy design, they would light up like a Christmas tree on radar. Also, artillery would be great, since orcs don't possess any counter battery tech, alongside next to all of their artillery guns being direct line of sight only weapons. Another thing to mention is that in an open engagement between Earth tanks and orc mechanized columns, Earth tanks, due to their range advantage, could probably take out 10 to 20 orc vehicles before having to retreat from the pursuing orc warbikes. With that said, although orc warbikes would ultimately be able to get to the sides of the armored vehicles and destroy them, they would for sure suffer heavy casualties from vehicles equipped with 20 to 30mm cannons, which would mow them down like they are reenacting D-Day all over again. With that said, in 2 to 3 days, orcs would control half of Africa, and the job of northern and central African countries to defend their territory would be made that much more difficult from all the refugee columns trying to run away from the Orcish onslaught. The casualties for orcs in these first invasion days would be heavy, but not that heavy, with probably 1 million orcs dead and 20 or so million Gretchens dead. But at least now the Central Africa would start receiving the reinforcements from the Mediterranean countries and the majority of air power from the European and Middle Eastern countries. Alongside that, developed countries like USA, China, Germany, France and others would start absolutely mass producing FPV drones. FPV drones are easily manufactured, cheap and can carry enough explosives to put any orc down. All of these reinforcements and air power would hold the orc advance north for a time. Remember, according to Orcish doctrine, if you encounter heavy resistance that you can't break through, you should loot your surroundings and build bigger and better weapons like Stompas and the Gargans, which would take roughly 2 to 3 weeks to get built. Until then, orcs would remain on the defensive. But this prep time would also allow NATO and Middle Eastern countries to send reinforcements, armored vehicles, artillery, drones and even more air assets like helicopters and surveillance aircraft to the areas in need. Also, an ocean of mines would be placed between the orcs and the human defenders, which would for sure either dish out horrific casualties to the attacking orc forces, or it would slow them down enough as to make them easy targets for artillery and MLRS systems. The US carrier strike groups would also be doing raiding missions along the coast, trying to spread out or neutralize as many orc assets as possible, as well as trying to save as many humans that were forcefully conscripted to work for the orcs, and also providing material and technical support to any resistance cells operating behind orc lines. And I think carrier strike groups would be tremendously effective in this, since F-35s are literally invulnerable when fighting orcs. Remember, orcs don't possess any form of radar and almost always rely on World War II era flak guns, which can neither detect nor reach F-35s. I keep mentioning F-35s since they are like the main US multi-role aircraft, but basically any aircraft would be effective against the orcs. Even A-10s could simply fly really high up and use fab glide bombs to neutralize orc targets. The only way I could maybe see orcs taking down some aircraft would be if they somehow managed to capture and turn human-made AA systems against the US. But AA systems of Southern Africa are either from the Cold War or straight up don't exist. And these Cold War era systems use easily trackable radar waves that can be detected and destroyed with HARM missiles. Also, orcs are way too dumb and impatient to know how to operate these sensitive pieces of equipment. And knowing all of this, it's highly improbable that orcs would ever be able to construct neither Gargans nor Stompas. These machines require a lot of material and space to be constructed, so they would be quite easy to detect. Just follow the large orc truck convoy carrying scrap metal and see where it goes. From then on out, you can just use cruise missiles or glide bombs to destroy the entire thing alongside tens of thousands of orcs. But that's boring, so let's just say that the orcs somehow managed to build 30 to 40 Stompas and 10 Gargans and start heading up north to break through the northern line of defense. Well, in a realistic scenario, this is where they would form up in a tight spearhead formation and become an actual threat that might break the North Africa defensive line. So realistically, they would just get nuked with 500 ICBMs. The reason as to why the earthly governments would not want to use nukes any earlier than this is because they would for sure want to preserve as many humans that are now living under Orcish occupation as possible. But using nukes is kinda boring, so let's say that they can't use those. Could they defeat Gargans and Stompas through any other methods? Well, Gargans have shielding, which doesn't allow fast moving projectiles to pass through, but it does allow smaller armored vehicles to pass through. So with that knowledge, if a projectile is moving slower than 100 km per hour, it should be able to pass through the shielding of the mechs. So here's what you do. You build an even larger and more up-armored Moab and you attach it to the parachute that would open up just before it hits the ground, so that it can slow itself down enough as to be able to pass through the shielding and hit the head of the Gargan, blowing it up, disabling the vehicle and maybe even bringing down the shielding. If this doesn't work, then just convert 3 to 4 C-130s into UAVs, fill them up with C4 and dive bomb them straight into the Gargan, and that should create enough of an explosion to bring down the shielding and take down the mech. Gargans are not that large, they are just about half as tall as the Statue of Liberty, so it should work. But doing all of this would take some time, so so the orcs would at least initially be moderately successful. I'd say that they would be able to break the northern defensive line, but it would cost them severely in both manpower and material, mostly due to mines and artillery. Gretchens would be especially hard hit, since unlike the orcs, they can be easily taken out by basically any weapon on the battlefield. And these losses would be non-replaceable, since it takes minimum 1 to 10 years for a new orc or Gretchen to come out of the mushroom sack. I'd say that this massive operation would cost the orcs roughly 50% of their overall force. But this breakthrough would also allow them to move up north towards southern Mediterranean states. But this would mean that they would have to cross the Sahara Desert, which would further reduce their numbers, since they would be easier targets for the self-destruction drones, UAVs, fab bones, cruise missiles, long-range SPG fire, and so much more. Also, if the earthly governments wanted to, they could by now start deploying poison gas attacks on the orcs, since by now they would be far enough from the large population centers as to not cause too much collateral damage. Meaning now they could start experimenting on what gas weapons work best at neutralizing orcs, which would probably be nerve agents. Orc shields also don't protect you from gas attacks, so this could be a far more affordable way to dispose of the orc gargans and stompas. All in all, this would probably reduce orc numbers even further to maybe just 10 to 20%, and Gretchens would by now be fully wiped out. From here on out, forces from Asia would be arriving daily via the Trans-Siberian Railroad, reinforcing the shattered lines of defense and filling the gaps wherever needed. Next, from here on out, FPV drones should be getting produced in large enough numbers that they can finish off any orcs that remain, so that the attacking human army doesn't incur any unnecessary casualties. The only thing left to do after that would be cleanup operations against the orcs defending occupied cities, and creation of some sort of virus or agent that would either make orc spores infertile or kill them outright. Modern scientists are highly adept at gene slicing and gene manipulation, so I have no doubt that in 4 to 5 years they would be able to cook up something that would work against the orcs. The only thing that's uncertain in this scenario is whether the earthly nations would band together to wipe out the orc menace once and for all, or just like the chaos dwarfs in fantasy, start creating and employing them as laborers and cheap cannon fodder for the military. So in short, I would give the orc invasion like a 5% chance of succeeding, and that's with restricted and nerfed humanity. Governments could at any point just decide fuck them civilians and start using poison gas attacks and nukes on populated areas and groups of orcs. So that would be it. If you liked this video, remember to smash the like button, comment down below if you agree or believe that I made a mistake somewhere. Until the next time, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.